Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Transforming Remediation, Understanding the Research, Policy, and Practice, co-hosted by the College and Career Readiness and Success Center at the American Institutes of Research and the American Youth Policy Forum. If during today's webinar you need technical support, please call the number on your screen, 1-800-263-6317. If you should lose connectivity during the webinar, please log back in and rejoin the session. Please note that both organizations will be live tweeting during today's webinar, and we encourage you to do the same. We will be using the hashtag RemedialED. In addition, we encourage you to ask questions during today's webinar using the question box in your webinar panel. Please direct your questions either to an individual panelist or the panel as a whole. For questions that we do not answer today, we will do our best to answer them in blog posting on the CCRS Center blog, Ready for Success. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Joe Harris, the Director of the College and Career Readiness and Success Center. Joe?
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everybody, our presenters and our participants as well. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, the College and Career Readiness and Success Center is part of a network of federally funded centers that provide technical assistance and resources to our regional partners and the states they serve on key educational reform issues. The American Youth Policy Forum is a critical lead partner of the CCRS Center. As a technical assistance hub, we collaborate with other federal and external centers and resource providers to promote CCRS knowledge development, dissemination, and utilization through technology-based activities such as this webinar series. We invite you to visit our website at ccrscenter.org to learn more about our other CCRS resources and activities and to access a copy of this webinar as soon as it becomes available in 2 to 3 days. As reflected in the report cited on this slide, and confirmed by our presenters today, there is a growing recognition that the current approach to post-secondary remediation is costly, time-consuming, and decreases likelihood of student degree attainment. Ultimately, there is a need to address this problem across the entire pre-kindergarten to grade 20 to workforce continuum, wherever students are not experiencing the levels of success they will need to thrive in the future. Today's webinar tackles an important part of this challenge by focusing on the transformation of post-secondary remediation from the policy, practice, and research perspectives of our presenters. In doing so, please note that the terms remediation and developmental education will be used interchangeably throughout the webinar. So let's get started with a brief introduction of our presenters. Bruce Vandal from Complete College America will open with the policy perspective by presenting the core principles for transforming remedial education. Katie Hearn will describe her experience both at Chabot College and leading the California Acceleration Project in developing accelerated remedial courses. We will then pause for some of your questions to both of those presenters. Again then, Cynthia Liston will describe the efforts in North Carolina to take a multi-pronged approach with community college leaders and faculty to transform remediation. And finally, Michelle Hodera will present her research on designing meaningful developmental reform. We will leave plenty of time for audience Q&A at the end as well, so don't forget to submit your questions via the questions box in your sidebar. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're at. I'm with you from Denver, Colorado, where I work with Complete College America, primarily working with states on how they can transform remedial education. As Joe illustrated at the outset, of course, we have such a very high percentage of students entering higher education now who require at least one remedial education course. Even more significant than that is the fact that very few students who ever get placed into a developmental or a remedial education course ever earn a post-secondary credential. by our estimates, only about 25% of students who, community college students who are placed into developmental education ever earn a credential in 8 years. And so the bottom line is that we need to do much, much more to ensure the success of students who enter our post-secondary institutions academically underprepared. Fortunately, and I think this webinar today will illustrate, we have learned a tremendous amount over the last several years about why students are not succeeding in developmental education, what some of the most successful strategies are to ensure the success of students who are underprepared for higher ed, and also, and maybe most exciting, is the fact that we're beginning to see some statewide models emerge for how to go ahead and serve the students that we need to and increase their success in post-secondary education. And over the course of today's webinar, you're going to learn more about some of those models as well. So one of the things that we've done at Complete College America is we thought it was critical, given the new research that we see and the emerging practice, to pull that information together. So we worked in partnership with the Education Commission of the States, with Jobs for the Future, with the Charles A. Dana Center, to develop a document called the Core Principles for Transforming Remedial Education, which attempted to capture the latest research and also tried to articulate in a very concise and hopefully easily understood way what we believe some of the core strategies or principles that institutions, states, and systems should employ to ensure increased success for students who are currently placed in developmental education. To give you just sort of a context for what we see as one of the central issues of developmental education, I'd like to show you a couple of different slides now. The first, looking at the issue of English remediation. So if you look at the top of this graph, you can see 10 students. And unfortunately, we have a system in place now that very few of those 10 students will ever make it through what we would call a gateway college course. That is a credit-bearing English course that applies to a college credential. Many instead are placed into a long sequence of what we would call remedial courses, those courses that do not apply to a college credential. Students nevertheless need to enroll in them. They're tuition-bearing, and oftentimes students will tap their financial aid for it. So in effect, extending the time that students will need in order to complete a college credential. And what this graphic shows is essentially that when you put students into multiple courses of remedial education, say 3 semesters of remedial English in this case, very few of them make it all the way through the gateway course. What happens is that the students either do not pass the gateway course, but what more often, or do not pass the remedial course, but what more often happens is that they actually never enroll in the subsequent course in the sequence. And so the bottom line is that the system is very leaky. Students do not persist from semester to semester. And so the end result is only about 2+ students in English ever pass the gateway course. We see the exact same trend in mathematics, if you look at the next slide, which illustrates even a more dismal picture, where essentially only about 1 in 10 students who are placed into 3 semesters of developmental education ever pass the gateway course. And so at the heart of the matter then is, how do we eliminate all of these attrition points that students encounter when they enter higher education and when they're placed into multiple semesters of developmental education? And so we have built the set of principles on how we might eliminate these attrition points and facilitate more success in gateway courses. So that leads us to principle number 1 that we have articulated in our core principles, and that basically it says that we should be measuring our success of students who enter higher education and are placed in developmental education, not on whether or not they complete a remedial course, but whether or not they ultimately make it to the gateway college course in English or mathematics and then pass that course. Unfortunately, too often we look at our problem in terms of whether or not students are passing courses. And in fact, from a faculty point of view, you can say that we can do a good job maybe in an individual course, and we can feel good about the fact that maybe 70% of our students complete our remedial course. But what we don't do is often track what happens to them after they leave our course. And so what we essentially are trying to articulate with Principle 1 is that systems, institutions, and faculty should measure their success not on whether or not students pass their remedial course, but whether they ultimately pass the gateway course, which that remedial course was designed for. So the bottom line is we are challenging states and institutions to think if they can design a system where students are passing gateway math and English courses within one academic year. Let's move on to the second principle. One of the other challenges of remedial and developmental education is so often that we've created a singular path, particularly in math, that leads students through college algebra. And that is, students must demonstrate skills that would be important for students to be successful in a college algebra class. However, very, very few students actually ever need college algebra to complete their program of study. They may choose a social sciences degree or a liberal arts humanities degree that really doesn't require college algebra. I mean, typically college algebra is really only for those students pursuing a calculus pathway, say in a STEM degree. So the bottom line is that we're making many, many students take and prepare for a course that they don't need to be successful in their college program. So we're advocating for a strategy where we differentiate the content that students need and the support that they're provided to ensure that their success only in the courses that they need to be successful in their program of study. So indeed, if a student is choosing a STEM pathway, as this graph shows, they should be preparing for college algebra, and we should do what we can to ensure that they have the skills for that. However, the vast majority of students in higher education are not enrolled in STEM, and instead are in one of these other fields that you see listed here, where quantitative reasoning or statistics might be more appropriate. So we think it's really critical that we find a way to design multiple pathways for students into gateway courses that are relevant to their program of study. Doing so, we think, can facilitate increased success in gateway courses and increased college completion. Let's move to the next slide, which articulates principle 3, which is that we should put an emphasis on placing as many students as we can into gateway college-level courses. In fact, we should see that as the default pathway. Unfortunately, the way that we've designed our system and research indicates is that when we have a question mark on whether or not a student is ready for gateway math or gateway English credit-bearing courses, our tendency is to more likely than not place them into a developmental course. And you can understand the logic of that. Well, they're not quite ready. Let's make sure that they get the skills they need, and then they'll really knock it out of the park when they get to the gateway. Unfortunately, the research doesn't support that. In fact, when you place students into even a single semester of remedial education, their likelihood of ever passing that gateway course goes down dramatically, simply because of that attrition question that I articulated earlier, but also because research suggests that when students are placed in developmental education, it can have a negative impact on their psyche. They really don't think they're college ready. So the bottom line is we need to develop strategies that result in more students being placed in gateway courses. And so when we assess students, it should be in a manner where we're asking ourselves the question, why shouldn't a student be in a gateway course, rather than why should they be? Let's move on to principle 4, which is, of course, there will be many students who will need additional support if we are to place them in gateway college courses. But we believe that the best way to provide that support is not by putting them into prerequisite remedial courses that they need to complete before getting access to the gateway course, but instead to enroll them into gateway college level courses and then provide additional academic support as a co-requisite, not a prerequisite. The bottom line here is that research is showing, and there are several models that are emerging that are showing that when you place students into the gateway course and then add a couple of hours a week of instruction or other types of academic support while enrolled in the gateway course, whether that's math or English, we find that students are far more likely to be successful in that gateway course. For one reason, because they're of course not going to lose, they're not going to fall out of the system between the time they take the remedial course and the gateway course, but also because that instructional model seems to be a more effective way to ensure students are learning the content they need to be successful. So if we look at the next slide, there are a variety of different ways that we can construct a co-requisite opportunity. We can do that through a single semester option, which Austin P. and the Community College of Baltimore County have implemented, where they align a remedial support course or another additional opportunity alongside the gateway course to ensure success. There is another model that uses 2 semesters to complete the same outcome, which is essentially placing students into a sequence of a single gateway course or 2 courses that teach the gateway content over 2 semesters. And then the third strategy is in career technical programs is to have students learn the basic skills content embedded within career technical program courses or parallel to it. In other words, not keeping them from their college career program courses by making them take remedial courses ahead of time. So those are just 3 examples of strategies that you can employ. Let's move on to principle number 5, which is that, of course, the question that is always asked is, what about those students who enter higher education with very, very low skills? What do we do about them where we might suggest that a co-requisite strategy might not be ideal? Well, we argue first and foremost that whatever we do, we should ensure that we're not replicating the existing system of long remedial sequences for these students. We need to think about accelerating our strategies and ensuring and providing every opportunity for students to complete gateway courses within 1 academic year. There are a variety of strategies are out there. One of them you're going to hear about in a few minutes from Katie Hearn, who's done work with students at the very lowest levels and found ways to contextualize and align the instruction in a single semester course and seen great success. And so we'll learn more about that in a few minutes. Let's move on to principle number 6. Principle number 6. Multiple measures should be utilized when we assess students or place them students into remedial courses. Bottom line is, right now, primarily the way institutions determine whether or not a student is ready for gateway courses is to place them into, use a single assessment, say like the Accuplacer or Compass exam. And the bottom line is that that exam oftentimes is not a very good predictor of whether or not a student can complete successfully a gateway college course. So as a result, we find many, many students getting placed in a developmental education who don't need to be there. What we're excited to find out is that there's new research that is showing that there are multiple measures, other measures, along with a placement exam that can increase our ability to really effectively place students into gateway college courses. So high school GPA, high school transcript data, or even a measure of non-cognitive ability, such as grit, are all strategies that we're beginning to see employed by institutions that gives institutions a far better idea on whether or not students can be successful in gateway courses. And maybe more importantly, it gives us better information about how to meet their needs in those gateway courses. And so we really are emphasizing to institutions to use multiple measures. And you'll learn more about one particular state's attempt at that in a little bit longer when Cynthia presents about North Carolina's efforts to use high school GPA. But as you can see here, there are several institutions and states that are using a variety of measures to include a measurement of grit, Angela Duckworth's tool, which really tracks whether or not a student has sort of the stick-to-itiveness skills, the persistent skills to be successful in higher education. And that's proving to be a very effective measure to determine success in gateway courses. And that leads us to our final principle, principle number 7, which is, of course, the bottom line in all of this is that ultimately students who are entering post-secondary education need to be ultimately entering programs of study and successful in those programs of study. So we're really encouraging institutions and states to develop systems where students are making some initial choices around what types of program they want to pursue, and then constructing the academic support they need and the gateway courses in a manner that are aligned to that particular choice. So the bottom line is that remedial support or academic support is not happening in a vacuum, but is actually part of a very structured academic program of study for students as soon as they walk on college campuses. And so if you look at the next slide, you can imagine what some of those meta majors might be: STEM, health sciences, social sciences, etc. We should be asking students to make some initial broad choices about what they intend to do, and then constructing their initial experiences both in terms of academic support and gateway support around that particular option. So just to illustrate one more time, we used this graphic before, the last slide, really shows sort of what we're talking about. Students make an initial choice. We design, say, for example, in mathematics, a particular gateway math course that they need to take, and then that then propels them into a particular program of study down the road. So to conclude, we really want to offer sort of states and institutions the following set of challenges, which essentially is, how do we find a way to increase the success of students in gateway college courses by putting many, many more students into co-requisite strategies, developing multiple pathways for students based on their desired program, so a STEM pathway, a non-STEM transfer pathway, etc., as a way to design the instruction appropriately, and then ultimately to use, and also to use a variety of measures to identify what the students' needs are and to construct the best option for them, ideally done so within a gateway college course. So ultimately, our goal is that many more students are passing gateway courses within one academic year. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. These principles certainly provide some good food for thought for those in our audience who are focusing on policy issues and around transforming post-secondary remediation. So now we'll hear from Katie Hearn from Chabot College and the California Acceleration Project. Katie?
Thank you. So I'll just say a tiny bit about my project first. The California Acceleration Project is funded through our State Community College Chancellor's Office Basic Skills Initiative, and we provide professional development to California's 112 community colleges around redesigning and accelerating their remedial English and math curricula so that more students actually complete the gateway courses in a reasonable period of time. And so we have 42 colleges right now that are piloting accelerated, redesigned English and math courses, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing with those. So next slide. So first I want to just echo what Bruce began with around high attrition in remedial sequences. And this is some California-wide data that's available through an online tool in our Chancellor's Office. And it shows that the lower down a student begins in remedial sequences, the lesser their likelihood of completing a college-level gateway course in English or math. On the English side, if a student starts 3 or more levels below college level, only 16% will complete a college-level gateway English course within 3 years. And on the math side, it's even bleaker. It's just 6% of students who are placed 3 or more levels below college math will complete a transferable college math course in 3 years. And there's an equity implication to this trend, which is that students of color are disproportionately placed into these lower levels. In California, it's more than half of Black and Latino community college students are placed 3 or more levels below college math. And so we're just having huge attrition and disproportionate attrition among students of color, which adds a layer of urgency to rethinking our approach to remediation. Next slide. So I want to just start by establishing that remedial attrition is a structural problem, and you could see this in the slide that Bruce shared. Students who are placed 2 levels below college English or math face 6 of what we call in CAP exit points where they fall away. Do they enroll in the first course? If they enroll, do they pass that first course? If they do pass it, do they enroll in the next course? And all the way up through completing just the initial college level English or math requirement. And the thing I want to say here is that the more opportunities we have for them to disappear from our system, the more that they do in a community college population in particular, that our students tend to be working other jobs, they tend to have higher poverty rates. There are a lot of forces that can pull them away from school, and the more drawn out their education is, the more opportunities we have to lose them, and we do lose them. We lose them at every single exit point. And the longer the sequence you build, the more exit points there are in their pathway. So I want to just illustrate this with some data from my own college, some descriptive data. Chabot College has our lowest level of developmental English is 2 levels below college level. And we don't have data on do they enroll in the first course. We don't actually know how many students get that placement into remediation and just decide to pull out right there. But we do know once they enroll that 66% of the students will pass that first developmental course 2 levels down within a 3-year period. And if they pass that course, 93% enroll in the next course, and 75% pass that course, and 91% of the successful students then enroll in the college level, and 78% pass. And one thing I want to point out is that those percentages are pretty good, and if you look at other colleges, they're actually quite a bit higher than many community colleges. But the thing that I learned from my colleague Myra Snell, who's my math partner in CAP, is that this is one giant multiplication problem. So if you click, what you'll see is you need to multiply all those individual percentages by each other to get what percentage of your your beginning group actually completes the gateway course. And then suddenly the percentages do not look decent anymore. Because just for those of you who are not math folks, that you're looking at 93% of the 66%, and then 75% of the 93% of the 66%. So you multiply those percentages, and you get only 33% of your beginning group of students that is actually completing the gateway course within 3 years. And one thing about our standard way of thinking in community colleges is to say, well, where's the problem there? Let's look at the data and we say, well, the problem is that first course, that 66% course. That the other percentages look pretty good, and so it's a very common first thought in a community college would be to say, well, let's get more students to pass that first course. Let's focus maybe a Title III grant, or let's have a college initiative around helping more students be successful in their first course. But what we like to do is just run through a thought experiment with it. So what we're going to do is say, well, what if we change that first percentage to 75%? What if we could get 75% of students across all of our sections of our entry-level developmental English course to pass? How would that change the end number? Well, then we get up to 37% of our original group completing the college level course in 3 years if we keep all the other percentages the same for the thought experiment. What if 80% pass the first course? Then it's 40% of our original group that goes on to complete the gateway course. What if 90% of students in all of our sections, full-time teachers, part-time teachers, across our entire college, our entry-level developmental course, if we could get 90% of students to pass that first course, which would be an incredible achievement, and I haven't seen it at any community college, but if we could do it, how many of the original group would pass the college level course? Like 45%. And then sometimes people say, but well, if you could get more to pass the first course, maybe the other percentages would go up. So then the question is, what if we could get 90% of students to pass and persist at each point in that equation, 90% across the board, then we get it up to 59% of the starting group goes on to complete the gateway course. And the reason we do this experiment is to just walk people through this to help them understand this bottom line. Yeah, the next slide. Is that improving our results within the existing multi-level system is never going to be enough to get student completion rates that we can feel good about as teachers. I don't think anybody could be happy with less than half of our students going on to complete their first transferable college level math and English course, that we're weeding out more than half of our students in the developmental sequence. So we argue that we need to fundamentally restructure our approach to underprepared students and eliminate all those exit points where we lose them. And this is where the principles that Bruce was talking about are really helpful. So there's two very promising models. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on what Bruce introduced initially, where we have established models of more accelerated approaches, redesigned approaches to remediation. The first is the co-requisite models, where students who are classified as remedial by whatever placement instrument you're using are placed into college level courses with additional time and support to help them be successful. And then 1 semester prerequisite models, which provide a single well-designed semester of preparation to students with any placement score. We have a couple of models of that in California that I'm going to share. And what we're seeing in both of these is that when the remedial pathway is shortened by a semester, we're seeing 20 or more percentage points higher completion of college English in these models. So next slide. First is from the Community College of Baltimore County, their accelerated learning program. And there are, I believe, more than 100 colleges across the entire country that are piloting their own version of this based on the success of CCBC. And this is a study by Community College Research Center and a sophisticated regression analysis to control for differences in the student population. And what they found is 25 percentage points gain when the students take the accelerated co-requisite model instead of going prerequisite and then into the college level course. Okay, and then the 1 semester accelerated prerequisite to college English my own district, both colleges in my district have been offering long-term an integrated reading and writing course that's open to students with any placement score below college level. And it's an alternative to our 2-semester remedial sequence, which we continue to offer. And offering both of these pathways allows us to see, well, what if students, what's the difference? What kind of outcome, how did the outcome change when we offer a 1-semester path as opposed to a 2-semester path of remediation? And again, we see more than 20 percentage points increase in completion of the college English course. And this is data that you could check. It's on our State Chancellor's Office website. This is descriptive data, not no regression involved. So I just want to point out the common features that at these 3 colleges, accelerated models are implemented at large scale and serving the majority of students below the college level. This is not the case of boutique programs by a few dedicated teachers that couldn't be scaled up. This is whole colleges where this is becoming the primary approach to serving underprepared students. And we also serve students with a wide range of placement scores. And part of the curricular and pedagogical emphasis in all 3 of these programs is to give remedial students the same tasks as college level students, but with more time and support to be successful at it. So we're not forcing students to do a whole semester of grammar review and then work a whole semester on writing just paragraphs. That we get them reading books and writing essays and doing higher order thinking, but we are providing a lot more support to help them with those tasks. Okay, next slide. I want to shift to the math world because inside CAP we also have an emphasis in math remediation. In the primary paradigm, this is also building on what Bruce introduced, that remediation should not be a repeat of K through 12 mathematics through Algebra 2. And instead, we're thinking of it as being tailored to the student's intended program of study or meta major. So if a student is going into STEM or other calculus-based majors, they do need some more intensive algebra preparation. But students that are going to go into a statistics or liberal arts math course for their program of study, all that algebra really is not what they need to be prepared for those courses. And so the next slide is just an illustration of that. And it's my colleague Myra made the slide, and she calls it the world's worst PowerPoint slide. So you cannot read it. But what I want you to notice is, where are things highlighted in orange? So if you can see the items that are highlighted in orange, then you're going to get the point. What you see here is a table of contents from a traditional elementary and intermediate algebra textbook. So this is a textbook that community college math courses would use for 2 semesters of courses, elementary algebra and intermediate algebra. And what my colleague Myra did was she brought this table of contents to a math department meeting in her college. And she said, I want you to take out a highlighter and highlight any topic that is essential to the study of statistics. So if a student is going to be studying statistics, what in all of this algebra preparation do they really need to learn statistics? And what's highlighted in orange is anything that anybody said was relevant to the study of statistics. She didn't even make it that they had to agree. If anybody highlighted something, it made the list. And what you can see is it's fewer than 10% of the topics that are covered in that textbook are actually relevant to the study of statistics, that there is a tremendous curricular disconnect between algebra preparation that is currently a forced prereq in a lot of systems, and certainly in California. Students are forced to go through intermediate algebra before they can take a college statistics course, even though the content is not truly prerequisite knowledge or skills. So what we have in CAP is colleges that are piloting accelerated pre-statistics courses where students are working on statistics from day 1. And then if they need to have a little bit of algebra or arithmetic review in order to be successful at statistics, it's built into the course. And student completion in our early data is 2 to 4 times higher than in the traditional multi-semester algebra sequence. And we have a third-party evaluation currently being conducted. Okay, so I want to close with just a few policy cautions. That policymakers in conversations about remediation, there's often talk of setting a floor for remediation, that some students are just too low to qualify for access to college. And that is a fundamental break from community college mission, and I think needs to be handled with tremendous care, because what we're seeing in the accelerated models at my own district at Chabot and Las Positas, that even students who are scoring in the lowest 5% of our placement test, which is AccuPlacer, they're passing the one semester accelerated course at a rate of 48%. And this may be a little bit lower than higher scoring students, but I don't think that anybody would have predicted that they'd be passing at that rate, especially if systems that are willing to write these students off and deny access to college education. They also do better in the accelerated course than they do in the slower pathway. And then at Los Medanos on the math side, completion of college math among students enrolled in accelerated remediation is 4 times higher than for students who enroll in the traditional 3 to 4 semester remedial sequence. So that students who had the lowest placement in the traditional sequence are seeing gains of four times as high completion of college math, transferable math course. Okay, the second caution I want to give involves English language learners, that the models that I'm talking about here on the English side are not English language instruction. They're really focused on academic literacy development among student populations that are generally fluent in English. They're not learning the English language. They're either advanced ESL students or they're native speakers. And I think it remains very much an open question is how can we take the principles of acceleration and adapt them to English language instruction. So I just want to caution that if you have a bunch of brand new English language learners, a 1 semester accelerated option may not be supportive or helpful for them, or at least it's an open question. The other policy caution that I want to give is just to raise a flag about algebra as the single standard of college readiness in mathematics. That I think there's a real danger right now with efforts like the Common Core could end up blocking promising pathway reforms by rigidifying this algebra-based standard of readiness. And I just want to offer the nuance that when you're thinking about high school competency and exit standards for high schools, then algebra makes more sense because high schools don't want to prematurely track students away from math-intensive fields. So you want to provide a broad mathematics education that could give a student options when they get to the college level and not track them away from a calculus-based major. However, once students get to the college level, they are choosing pathways, and these pathways include different quantitative requirements. And so we really argue that remediation should be aligned with these requirements, not simply just replicating the high school curriculum. I think we're actually struggling with this at the policy level in California right now, and it's making it harder to scale up these promising accelerated models. And then the final policy caution that I want to leave you with is that the kinds of models we're describing here are a fairly significant break from traditional approaches to remediation, and certainly from many of the textbook and software products that are on the market. And so to make this kind of shift, if a state is considering statewide implementation, they really need to devote some resources to collaborative, peer-based professional development around supporting faculty to change what and how they're teaching and be successful with these new models. And I think California, with the Basic Skills Initiative and the 3CSN professional development arm of that initiative, is a good model, and that faculty in California are really benefiting from that kind of support. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Katie. So let's take some time to ask a few of the questions that have been coming in the chat box. And I'm going to throw out this question to both of you. And so the question is, does success effort remediation differ for students attending 2-year institutions versus students attending 4-year institutions? Bruce, why don't you take the first stab at that?
Yeah, so of course the data does suggest that students who are taking remediation at 4-year institutions will be a little bit more successful, and you can imagine why that might be. A lot of 4-year institutions are not open access, and as a result, they may have a higher quality of student coming in the door. At least I shouldn't say higher quality. I should say students that might, a higher percentage that are more prepared. And so community colleges take all comers, and they're taking students with the widest range of abilities. And so nevertheless, we're seeing results in four-year institutions that are still not acceptable, and still very low percentages of students passing gateway courses at four-year institutions when they're placed into remedial education.
Katie, what about your...
Yeah, I would add to that that in addition to having a sort of a wider range of incoming skill levels that in an open access community college, that our population, when a student applies to and enrolls at a four-year school, they're typically doing it with a plan, with a fairly long-term plan, whereas in a community college, they often are doing it semester by semester, that they might have a goal of transferring, but they're often enrolled part-time, and maybe their family situation shifts and they decide they're gonna go full-time one semester, but then take the next semester off, or go part-time the next semester because they got more hours at work. And so there's just, I think that the way that students' lives are interacting with their schooling, there are many more forces that are pulling community college students away from concentrated full-time study and completing a degree within a four-year period.
Great. So there have been several references to exit points. So a question's come in, is it beneficial to make students aware of potential exit points along the remedial pathway? Does giving them awareness empower them to succeed?
I would say, you know, from my classroom perspective, that I think it's very helpful to do that, that I make it a point to share this kind of research with my students and talk with them about these issues. Yeah, I would say so.
Bruce, any other comments?
I would say, yes, it's helpful, but I think at the end of the day, that's not a replacement for eliminating these exit points as much as possible. So if you have a program where you might have on one hand a co-requisite strategy for students versus a multiple semester model, I think we really should do everything we can to encourage students to consider the co-requisite strategy because of what we know. So it's not just simply to inform them about the exit points, but to actually encourage them to pursue models that accelerate their progress.
Touche. Let's question to both of you. Would you comment a little bit about alignment with K-12 in the areas such as efforts to assess student readiness as they leave high school, curricular alignment, partnership opportunities between K-12 and higher ed? Your thoughts on that? Bruce, why don't you go first?
Sure. I mean, I think this is actually a very important area of consideration. In particular, we would really encourage states to think about their strategy when it comes to underprepared students in a manner that aligns what's going on in the higher education reform world with what's going on the K-12 reform world. And so, frankly, from our point of view, if you develop a model where you're assessing students in 11th grade, and then if they are not optimally ready for college, providing them academic support during that senior year, and in some cases even getting them through gateway courses through dual enrollment in the senior year, and then when you consider the effectiveness of co-requisite strategies, when you put that all together, I really do believe that it's foreseeable that if not most, if not all, a vast majority of high school graduates should be able to enter higher education without requiring standalone remediation. And I really think that's a goal that's achievable when we look at what the research is doing and what we see the progress on some of the reforms in K-12 promise. And there are many states that are well positioned to accomplish just that.
Great, thanks.
I would agree with all of that, and I would also just remake the caution about the math side, that it's really important that we think about once a student is at the college level, has arrived and is designated underprepared in math and haven't met maybe their algebra requirements in high school or however we define that, that we not see remediation at the post-secondary level as simply repeating high school mathematics, that we think about tailoring it to programs of study. That would be the only sticking point for me to really stress.
Great, thanks. So we'll try to get more questions in at the end of the presentation, but we do need to move on to give our other presenters opportunity to share some of their work with us. So let's now hear from Cynthia Liston about North Carolina's approach to transforming remediation in their community college system. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be a part of this. I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit and share what we have been doing here in North Carolina, where we've been working on system-level redesign of developmental education really since late 2009. So if we can switch slides here, please. This is a slide that has become quite famous, if not infamous, in North Carolina, because it does share, similar to what Bruce and Katie have already described, the leaky pipeline in terms of students who are placing at low levels, in this case of developmental math, and the percentage that actually successfully completes a gateway course. This comes from research that was done for North Carolina by the Community College Research Center. And in 2010, President Scott Rawls of the system here conducted listening tours at all 58 of our community colleges and shared a great deal of data about student success. And this is the one that probably caught the most attention and certainly galvanized and became a driver of our state-level initiative to transform developmental education in the state. And again, it's very similar to the national data, and you'll see the red percentages there show the students who are not enrolling or were not enrolling in the next level of a 16-week semester developmental math course, and that's what led to a total of around 8% successfully completing a gateway math course after several years. Next slide, please. So in response to this data, North Carolina became one of 6 states nationally that took part in the Developmental Education Initiative, which was supported by the Lumina and the Gates Foundation, to really take a very in-depth policy look at how we could do better, because basically looking at those numbers, we knew that something needed to change. To provide a little context, because I know not all states are similar in terms of how they're structured around community colleges, we are a state system with 58 colleges and a combined course library, so we do have common numbering for our courses, which gives us an ability to do this kind of state-level curricular redesign that I know is not possible in every state. However, we aren't quite as centralized as some other states in terms of community colleges across the country, in that each of our colleges does have a local board of trustees who hires the president. So in 2009, President Rawls named a DEI state policy team to steer this effort, and it comprised more than 30 individuals, ranging from the state superintendent for K-12 education, State Board of Community College members, a former legislature, but also many individuals from our institutions themselves, college presidents, administrators, faculty, representatives of faculty associations, so a really wide-ranging group to steer this effort. And overall, there have been 4 big goals for our DEI initiative: reducing the overall need for developmental ed, which is that key kind of K-12 alignment piece, reducing time to complete developmental education, implementing better tools to assess and place students, and improving and making sure that we have the ability to track well and evaluate whatever we have done so that we can drive towards future improvements. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about what we've done at a very high level here. This has been a multi-year initiative, and there's been a lot of moving pieces and a lot of parts, but I'm going to describe them in 2 sort of basic buckets. The first is the curricular redesign piece, and then the second bucket will be the changes that we've made in how we place students. So in terms of curriculum redesign, the DEI state policy team adopted design principles to steer what the new curriculum would look like, both in math and in English and reading. We started with math because that was the area where the results were most alarming in terms of student outcomes. So that was a process that started basically in late 2010 in terms of the redesign of the curriculum, and took about 8 months. And then a year later, we started with the English and reading. Because we are a large state with a lot of colleges, we knew we couldn't have too many cooks in the kitchen in terms of the individuals involved in doing the redesign. So we established a nomination process and a review committee to select 18 faculty design teams to steer to steer the redesign. And really one thing that I think is worth pointing out here is that the design principles themselves were important and were definitely the charge to this faculty team, but they were not overly prescriptive. We really did leave a lot of white space for the faculty to fill in terms of owning and contributing and really shaping this curriculum. And so I think there was really sort of a recognition and an honoring of the expertise of the faculty. And while I know that there are individuals across the state who were not part of the redesign team who perhaps would have liked to have been part of it, I think overall this process was really quite transparent, and even folks who didn't take part personally sort of saw the integrity and the engagement of faculty and the fact that this was a faculty-driven curriculum project. And that has really been helpful, I think, in terms of support for the results of what the teams have done. So in terms of math, what the results were is that they created a new developmental math curriculum that reduced by about 1/3 the content compared to what had previously been there. And it's an acceleration strategy based on 8 one-credit modules. So we went from 3 16-week semester-long courses to 8 one-credit-hour modules. And students only take the modules that they need based on a diagnostic assessment. It's also important to state that we do have multiple exit points, similar to what Bruce and Katie have talked about. Depending on what your intended program is, you don't have to necessarily take or pass out of all 8 modules. We've got 3 different separate exit points for students who are going into STEM, non-STEM, and some vocational pathways. And in fact, after this work, we ended up working on creating some more intentional math pathways on the curriculum side of the house too, sort of paying attention to the fact that once students have experienced this kind of acceleration and focus in developmental, for those who are in developmental, it's important to have that kind of emphasis at the curriculum level as well. There's also been a pedagogical shift that's been emphasized with this new curriculum, focusing on conceptual understanding and really emphasizing application of concepts as opposed to more procedural-based instructional approaches. That's something that is embodied in the curriculum. I would say that, and I'll kind of talk about this a little bit at the end too, it's in a system as big as ours, it's hard to do the sort of large-scale professional development that we would like to really enable and facilitate that actual shift. So that's something that we're still working on. And then finally, again, in terms of honoring sort of the autonomy that our institutions are looking for, there's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of the instructional materials that folks use, nor the delivery methods. One thing that was discussed during the redesign process was coming up with a common exit assessment for each of the modules, but that was a place that we ultimately decided we couldn't really get to, and so colleges still have that level of sort of local control as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, 1 year later, we emulated or simulated the same process and chose a 18-member English and reading faculty team. And one of the design principles was from the beginning, was to integrate what had been at most of our institutions 2 separate developmental disciplines, one focused on reading and one focused on English. We already had about 10 colleges that had integrated the 2, but we knew that was something that would really help with the acceleration and reducing the amount and kind of the structural components of developmental curriculum. So based on their work, the overall DevEd English and Reading sequence has been reduced by about 50%. And for students who place into DevEd at all levels, the most that they would take would be 3 8-week, 3-credit-hour sort of mini-mester courses. We also did draw from the page of the Community College of Baltimore model that's already been discussed, and we have a co-requisite option for students who are near college ready. That's a 2-credit-hour course that supplements or complements English 111, which is our freshman comp course. Next slide. So that's a very high-level description of what we've done in terms of curriculum redesign in North Carolina. with respect to placement changes, there are two kind of key components. One I've already mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about, and that is our custom diagnostic assessment and placement test, and the other is multiple measures for placement. I'm going to talk about multiple measures for placement first because I think it's the one that ultimately is going to have the most impact in terms of placing students and reducing the number of students who are in DevEd in our system, and then I'm going to talk about the placement test. So as you recall, one of our goals from the beginning of this DEI initiative was to have better tools to assess and place students. And so early on during the DEI initiative, we contracted with Community College Research Center to look at high school transcript data of our own students, of our community college students, and to identify if there were better predictors of their success within our institutions than the placement tests that we had been using, mainly AccuPlacer and Compass. So they were able to match transcripts for about 20,000 students and looked at a lot of different data points, grades, course-taking patterns, and found that by far the greatest predictor of a student's success within our institutions is their cumulative high school GPA. And we were somewhat surprised. We expected that perhaps certain grades in math courses, for example, would hold more value, but really in talking with the researchers and in having conversation with them and around the state for a good deal of last year, what sort of the operating theory is that high school GPA is in and of itself a multiple measure because it measures not only your content knowledge in terms of how well you've done, but it's also a measure of persistence because it shows over the long haul how a student has done, not just how they've done in a single course, for example. So based on that research, we took to our State Board of Community Colleges a policy in February of this year, which has been adopted, that students who have graduated within 5 years and have an unweighted GPA of 2.6 and have taken 4 math courses in high school can bypass placement testing and directly enroll in curriculum courses, both English and math. So that's a big change. Colleges have up to 2 years to implement this policy. We have 17 that are starting this fall, and more will be implementing the policy. We'll be paying close attention to how those students do, and in particular, really focusing on the kinds of instructional supports that need to be provided to students who are perhaps borderline students under the previous policy, and colleges are really thinking about how to sort of ramp up supports for students who may need more assistance. As I mentioned, part of the curriculum redesign, one of the design principles is that we would have a custom test for our students to determine which modules that they need, for example, in math, and to place them into this integrated English and reading assessment. So we have a contract with College Board, and they have created the math test and are working right now on the English and reading test, which will be rolled out early next year. One of the advantages of this in terms of student acceleration is that you basically test out of individual modules, and so you can skip those. The idea is that it will more discreetly assess a student's skills or proficiency gaps if there are any, and so students don't have to be exposed to content that they may have already mastered. And the old placement tests were much more global and sort of generic in terms of what they were looking at. And again, students, based on their intended program of study, don't have to take all of the modules necessarily. So we really see a lot of acceleration potential with this new assessment as well. Next slide. Challenges. I mentioned professional development to accompany the new curriculum is a big challenge. That's something that's typically handled at the local level, and we know that in a state like ours, where we have small rural colleges that don't have as many resources as some of our larger urban institutions, for example, that there's sort of there's variable levels of professional development that are available, so that's something that we're really focusing on in the next year or so. Also, the colleges, in terms of the student services side of the house, have really had to adapt to this new structure, and it's not always easy. They're having to create new business processes for placing and enrolling students, and adapting to 4-week courses increases the level of registration and sort of touches, so to speak, that colleges have with students. And so while we know this is something that's being done for student success, we also recognize that it can be a challenge for our institutions. And lastly, financial aid, particularly Veterans Administration eligibility, has been a struggle for us. Some of these acceleration module or strategies do not really fit within the conventional kind of regulations and policies, particularly at the federal level. And I'm not the federal or the financial aid expert in the office here, but that's something that we're continuing to work with and advocate for our colleges on some of those issues. Finally, I want to share a website that we have here at the North Carolina Community College System Office. It's called successnc.org. The DEI initiative is one of many student success efforts within the state that's designed to increase the number of students who successfully complete credentials or transfer within our system. And there's a lot of documents there, webinars, videos, all sorts of resources. So my email is also there if anyone would like to contact me in the future.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. It's very interesting to see the similarities and contrasts between the work you're doing in North Carolina and some of the things Katie reported out about California. So let's now turn to our final presenter, Michelle Hodera from Education Northwest, who will provide a research perspective on the previous presentations. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Hi, thanks very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Hodera, and I'm a senior researcher at Education Northwest in Portland, Oregon. And today you've heard about really innovative ways colleges in California and North Carolina are reforming developmental education. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the challenges that can inhibit the design of developmental education reform based on a research report I co-authored with Shauna Jaggers at the Community College Research Center. So in this study, we set forth what we call the opposing forces framework, which lays out 3 sets of opposing forces that have a direct impact on developmental education policy. We call them opposing because while each goal is important, these goals tend to work in opposition to one another. So in this presentation, I'm going to describe these opposing forces as well as some ways to resolve them to design meaningful developmental education reform. The next slide, please. Thank you. So the first set of forces we found to be common at community colleges nationwide is the tension between system-wide consistency versus institutional autonomy. So I'm going to begin with the case for system-wide consistency. Common entry-level standards send a consistent message to high schools regarding standards of college readiness. They make it more feasible for systems to track student performance across colleges, and they smooth the process of transfer between colleges. So overall, system-wide consistency may reduce inequity and confusion for students. But when there's no research-based consensus on the most effective developmental education policies and practices, enforced consistency of entry-level standards and other developmental education policies and programming choices may guarantee nothing more than uniform implementation of ineffective policies and practices. So as a result, colleges may feel that resisting consistency is the only rational strategy because it allows them to tailor their entry-level standards and their developmental education policies, course structures, curriculum, and sequences to meet the needs of their particular mix of students. But in doing so, colleges squander the benefits of system-wide consistency. So how do you resolve this tension? Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So one way is through enacting system-wide policies through a process that honors autonomy. And this is similar to a process Cynthia briefly described that took place in North Carolina. Through our research, we also studied a standardization process in New Jersey, where community college faculty from across the state came together to decide on common cutoff scores for placement into college coursework. Faculty on math and English subcommittees made recommendations for common cutoff scores that were adopted at the 19 community colleges across the state. The above quote describes the bottom-up process that took place to arrive at common entry-level standards. Perhaps the most important outcome of this statewide standardization process is that it prompted administrators and faculty to think more critically about developmental education assessment and placement at their colleges. As a result, this process prompted a number of New Jersey community colleges to begin using additional measures to determine placement, in addition to the state agreed upon cutoff scores. So I'm going to move on to the second tension. So the second tension is between efficient and effective assessment. So almost all community colleges use standardized tests to assess the academic preparedness of incoming students. These tests are beneficial because they allow colleges to assess thousands of entering students quickly and cheaply and instantaneously determine the course placement for each student. But this administrative efficiency goes hand in hand with high rates of student attrition and failure from courses. A big reason for this is because these exams don't actually predict student performance as well as we might wish. Test validity is low for a number of reasons. One, students often do not prepare for these tests and their performance does not actually reflect their true capability. So reforms around placement test preparation are particularly important. But even if students do prepare, standardized exams may not be aligned well with the college's curriculum. So they may not measure the skills and knowledge students need to be successful in college coursework. Finally, college success is a function of far more than academic skills measured in a single sitting taking an exam. So other measures, such as high school GPA, which Cynthia briefly talked about, may better represent a student's ability to succeed in college. So what's one way to resolve this tension? Next slide, please. So one way to maintain efficiency and improve the accuracy of course placement is to think about using additional measures to determine students' need for remediation or readiness for college coursework. So these figures are from an analysis of data from a large urban community college system. As Cynthia said, there's a complementary study for North Carolina, but this is a different analysis for a large urban system. And this analysis found that using the best of either high school transcript data or test scores lowered remediation rates and increased the rates of students earning a C or better in college-level classes. So looking at the top bar chart, you can see that using only the compass placement exam, 81% of students were assigned to English remediation and 75% to math remediation. Looking at the bottom bar chart, you can see that using only the compass placement exam, 72% of students assigned directly to college-level English received a C or better and passed, while 67% of students assigned to math received a C or better and passed. When these measures are used in combination for course placement, remediation rates increase, as do college course pass rates, and those are those middle bars in the first bar chart and the lower bar chart. But now if you look at the third set of bars, this is a situation in which a college could adopt a policy of using the best of performance on the compass or using high school transcript data. And you can see that if you look at the top bar chart, remediation rates drop in English to 69% and in math to 67%. But college course pass rates are slightly higher compared to only using the compass. They rise in English to 76% and in math to 68%. So this is because using the best of policy results in more students being accurately placed into college-level coursework instead of remediation. So I'm going to go on to the third tension. So the third and last tension I'll talk about is between supporting student progression versus enforcing academic standards or upholding them. So we know that there's a push to increase college completion, but this is hampered by high rates of remediation. And we've talked about the data that show that about a quarter or 28% of developmental students earn a credential. And both Katie and Cynthia showed that the longer the remedial sequence, the less likely students are to complete it and enroll in and complete college classes. So this is the structural problem of developmental education. But on the other side, reforms designed to support progression may result in a greater number of underprepared students in college classes. And then faculty may be faced with the choice between relaxing standards or failing a large number of students. The idea of relaxing standards strikes at the heart of preparing students for subsequent coursework and giving them the skills they need to succeed in college. But failing lots of students is also disillusioning. So how can we resolve this tension? The next slide, thank you. So one way is through what we've talked about in this panel, acceleration models. And so the above chart shows results from a number of different studies on acceleration by the Community College Research Center. The numbers are the differences in outcomes for students in 5 different accelerated developmental pathways compared to their peers who enrolled in traditional developmental sequences. And the stars represent a significant difference in the outcomes. So these pathways vary widely from another, with the only commonality that they represent shorter or accelerated developmental education pathways. The CUNY results are based on a study that compares the impact of shorter versus longer developmental sequences. 3 of the programs, Fast Start at the Community College of Denver, Accelerated English at Chabot, and the Accelerated Learning Program at the Community College of Baltimore, are highly planned acceleration programs. In addition to accelerated pathways, these programs include professional development for faculty, a rigorous curriculum for students, academic supports, and with Fast Start, non-academic supports for students. So results indicate that across all accelerated pathways, students were more likely to complete entry-level college math and English than students from non-accelerated pathways. So for example, if we look at Fast Start combines 2 sequential developmental math courses into 1 course that students complete in a single semester. Students who participated in Fast Start were 14 percentage points more likely to complete entry-level college math, so college algebra, within 3 years compared to their peers who participated in a traditional math sequence. For the accelerated writing and English sequences, we can see that the boost in college English course completion was accompanied by an overall increase in students' college-level credit accrual. And that increase was strongest at Chabot with 5 college credits, where the accelerated sequence eliminates an entire developmental course, allowing students to fit in an additional college-level course into their schedule. And then finally, if we look out to degree attainment, we can see that boost in college course completion translated to small increases in graduation rate. 3 years subsequent to their participation, accelerated students were 0 to 3 percentage points more likely to earn a degree, and these differences in degree attainment persisted or grew over time. All right, so I'm going to end with some questions for you all. So the first set of questions is for both system-level and college-level staff to think about the value of system-wide entry-level standards. But it's also relevant to think about the value of implementing any system-wide policy in developmental education policy. You know, which policies should be system-wide and which may work better being implemented at the college level. And then the next 2 sets of questions are more for college-level administrators and faculty to think about while considering reforms to assessment and placement, as well as their developmental pathways. So what do you want these to look like, and who should be involved in determining how to design and implement these reforms? So thank you very much. You can download this report at that link, and all the research that I referred to in this presentation is also available on the research website. You can contact me if you can't find it and I can get it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle. This certainly has been a lot of information to digest across all 4 of the presentations. Not surprisingly, we're getting a lot of questions pouring in, and we want to spend a few minutes toward the end now addressing some of those questions. In general, we tend to have questions that I think would be easy to answer, or we'd like to have answers from all 4 of the presenters, but we do have one specific question that came in for Cynthia, and I'm going to pose that one first and then propose a way for us to let each of you address some of the other questions. So Cynthia, how have student outcomes changed as a result of North Carolina's system-wide changes?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, the short answer is we don't know yet. So in terms of where we are with implementation, this fall is the first semester that all 58 colleges will be using the new developmental math curriculum. The old courses are being archived. And in addition, this fall is when all colleges have access to the new combined developmental English and reading courses. However, they have 1 year to complete the transition, so that gives them some flexibility in terms of local implementation. So we actually do have a contract with CCRC to do a long-term and fairly large-scale evaluation of all of the changes that we've done in DevEd, and they have started their work, but we don't have any sort of true outcomes. I can say anecdotally that I hear from institutions who have already started using the math modules that they are seeing increased success rates. So I feel positive, but we can't point to true outcomes yet.
Great, thanks. So what I would propose we do now is I'm going to pose a question and we'll follow a sequential order, starting first, the order of the presentation, starting with Bruce, followed by Katie, followed by Cynthia, and then Michelle, inviting each of you to pose an answer from your perspective to the question with the understanding that you may want to take a pass on it or defer to someone else on the panel to answer the question. So first of all, question number one, what are the impacts of remediation on enrollment? Are students being discouraged from enrolling because it will take them longer to complete the time needed for the remediation itself? Bruce?
Well, I think Michelle could probably present on this given the CCRC research, but there is evidence that suggests that when students are placed in developmental education, particularly those students who just miss making it into gateway courses, there is a significant discouragement effect, and that in fact placement in fact does not facilitate sort of success into the gateway course because students get discouraged.
Thanks. Katie, now I'm not going to jump in between, so Katie, you're next.
Okay. I actually would just defer to, I think, Michelle to speak more on that. I think Bruce has provided a good initial answer.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I would just say that going back to the analysis we had of our math pipeline, 23% of students who were placed 3 levels or more in math in terms of developmental ed never enrolled in the first course.
Michelle, everybody's deferring to you, so.
Well, yeah, as Cynthia said, descriptively, you can definitely see that students, there's a large proportion that don't enroll at all in the first course they're placed into. I think those results vary when you start to talk about the causal impact of developmental education on student enrollment in college, and I think that will vary based on the context. So sometimes it might not have any impact, sometimes it might have a negative impact. So that the causal impact might vary, but descriptively, yes, definitely, you can see a proportion of students never enrolling.
So our next question is, what role does faculty buy-in play in adopting and implementing remediation redesign policies? Bruce?
I'm going to let Katie jump in first.
I would say it's huge. So California has a very decentralized community college system where each college has its own curricula, and we have local boards or district boards across the entire state. So our work in the California Acceleration Project is very much grassroots around making the case for reform to faculty and catalyzing faculty to make local change and change their curricula on their own campuses. And I think that's been really important to the work. That said, I do think that some level of system clarity. So Michelle pointed out earlier that there's no absolute answer about this model is the model that will work for all colleges in all contexts, and I totally agree with that. But I think that we can distill down from the research some central principles about what does and does not work, and that it's very clear from the research that the multi-level approach to remediation is not yielding good results. And so I would say that helping faculty to understand that is really important in terms of mobilizing change, but then it is helpful to have some system level clarity about not creating this kind of ineffective structure, that there can't be so much local control that we could keep building such ineffective structures.
And I would add, I have described what we've done in North Carolina as a top-down, bottom-up model, in that we did provide a very clear charge from the state level, but we would not be where we are today if it weren't for dedicated, passionate faculty members who really steered this ship to where it has landed. And if I facilitated the work of both the math team and the English and reading team, I was typically the only person from our system office who was at those meetings, and this, and we the faculty have been the ones to champion the new curriculum throughout the state. Doesn't mean that we don't have some naysayers, but we have a lot of support from faculty, and we couldn't have accomplished this without their involvement.
Yeah, and I just want to add that in our qualitative research, we continually hear this fear of relaxing standards with acceleration models. But, you know, if you observe or hear about the models that Katie Hearn and her colleagues implement, the curriculum and instruction is extremely rigorous, and the expectations for students are extremely high. And so, you know, I think the structural change of accelerating students through shorter sequences is important, but also thinking about those curricular and instructional changes are also important because they, you know, they come along with all this great rigorous curriculum that sometimes is a new paradigm for developmental students.
Okay, so a question again to everybody. What are the challenges of accelerating remedial reading and writing as opposed to math? Bruce, you want to take a stab at this?
I actually think that we're seeing a lot more progress on the reading, writing, English front. Math has got far more difficulty in terms of what we're seeing in terms of implementation at scale. I think and Katie can definitely speak to this more than I can, but I think that we're definitely seeing more of a movement to how we combine reading and writing together as a strategy, and Katie is doing that, I think, very effectively, and seeing that as sort of maybe the primary hurdle as opposed to challenges around co-requisite or accelerated strategies around English. At least we're finding in states there's a lot, it's resonating and progressing much more quickly in English than it is in mathematics.
Yeah, I would echo that. In California, we provide in-depth support to colleges that are piloting accelerated English and math, and we typically have about 2 English faculty for every 1 math faculty member participating, or two English colleges for every 1 college piloting in math. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, on the English side, there's an intuitive way that accelerated models make sense to faculty, which is to say, to be ready for college English, students should be practicing college English, or they should be doing college English with support. So it's not that big of a paradigm shift, because if we teach college English, we know what that looks like, and we can develop curricula that look like that. But on the math side, this pathway, the shift toward thinking about math paradigms rather than just marching all students through the high school algebra curriculum, is a really different shift. And in some cases, the faculty themselves may not have expertise in statistics. They might be primarily from a calculus-based track themselves. So it's a sort of there's a disciplinary obstacle there. There's also this idea among math faculty that to reduce any of those content topics is inherently a dumbing down of rigor, which we argue is not the case, that you can have an incredibly rigorous statistics-based curriculum, that algebra doesn't have to be the only definition of mathematical rigor or quantitative reasoning rigor. But people are very attached to their disciplines, and it can get very heated, and often a political solution in a math disciplinary context is to just keep adding topics, to say every educated human being must be able to, and then just keep adding to the list of math topics. And so it's very much, the politics of it are a lot more complicated.
You know, I can really speak primarily from North Carolina's perspective. I think we had an advantage on the math side because our community colleges, many if not most of them, started as technical institutions. And so even with our old developmental curriculum, we had multiple exit points depending on what a student was doing. So for our faculty in our colleges, it wasn't such a paradigm shift that everybody wasn't going to end up in college algebra. That was kind of a given. So I would say, but along the lines of what Katie said, the fact that on English and reading, everybody is pretty much pointed towards a single gateway English freshman comp course made that somewhat easier. I think the hardest part for acceleration within English and reading is just, with math, the conversations with the faculty were really around pretty discrete and easy to parse out student learning outcomes. With English and reading, we're really talking about the same competencies in DevEd, in college courses. It's like the conversations were more nuanced in terms of what is college level work, how do we, so it's a more nuanced conversation. But for me, bottom line, my experience was that each was its own unique animal, and they were really quite different from each other, but I wouldn't say one was harder than the other.
Michelle?
Well, in our scan of developmental education reforms across the country, we saw that there's certain acceleration reforms that are just more common in math, shortening the sequence, creating modules, the statistics pathways gaining more ground. But what's not as common in math, and it's more common in English, is that co-requisite model. And so that's still something that's less common in math, the mainstreaming co-requisite model that was discussed.
Great. So let's ask another question. Hopefully we can get through this one. Looking at the workforce side of the continuum, how well aligned are current college courses with skills needed for the workforce, and how do remedial courses address this need? Bruce?
Well, I think this speaks to the point, particularly in mathematics, and also in English to a certain extent, where we want to make sure that students are only taking the content and are being prepared for the content that's necessary not only for that gateway course, but ultimately connects and aligns with their program of study. And so this is why we need to spend more time really working and talking to students about what their career goals are, what their academic goals are, and not be focusing them singularly on that traditional college algebra path, but thinking about if indeed they are thinking about a social sciences field, then statistics is going to be important. And so thinking about and being much more conscious about getting students on the right path, and then contextualizing that support within that objective. So we're not just teaching them this math content without devoid from what it is that they're there to accomplish. And so I think if we do that, we're going to start actually seeing more efficacy around math success, because students are going to see the relevance of it, right? And of course, as our friend Uri Treisman likes to say, when it comes to college algebra, most people will tell you that the only time they've used college algebra is to help their children with their college algebra homework. And so I think the idea here is to think about aligning it much more effectively to what their programs are and what their goals are.
I would agree with that, and then just pass on to the other presenters.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think North Carolina is also a completion by design state, and one of the key emphasis within that initiative is getting students into programs of study as quickly as possible, and really strong advising and career counseling upon entry. And so, with these new strategies, and it's a little bit of a more complex landscape for students to navigate, and we have to be. One of the things that we have to pay attention to is we're really working on helping students who come to our institutions successfully move towards a credential, but we also want to help them make sure they're entering in the right door, and having more work-based experiences is another effort that we're really embedding in our work these days.
I agree with what's been said.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm told that unfortunately we're running out of time, even though I have a list of 3 or 4 more questions that I'd like to ask. We will be able to post those answers on our blog, and we'll get back to you in other ways with additional information. I do want to take the opportunity to once again say thank you to our speakers today for their excellent presentations and for providing a great deal of important information on transforming post-secondary remediation. And I also want to thank Jennifer Lerner and our colleagues at AYPF for their work in organizing and helping organize this webinar. The audio portion of the webinar and all the slides will be posted on both the CCRS Center and AYPF websites very shortly. And please remember to complete the pop-up survey when you leave the webinar so that we can use your input to continuously improve our webinar series. And finally, I want to thank you, our audience, very much for attending the webinar. Best wishes.